Good morning, everyone. My name is Robert Gott, and it is my privilege and pleasure to introduce our acclaimed and accomplished short story writers this morning. But before we do, it is, I think, right and proper that we acknowledge with all due humility that we meet on Gunditjmara land. I'll introduce our writers one by one. In the middle is Ben Walter, who's a Tasmanian writer of fiction, essays, poetry, and experimental nature writing, which sounds exhausting. And he is the past fiction editor of Island magazine. That's flash. His short stories are very widely published throughout Australia. To Ben's right is Josephine Rowe, who is an award-winning writer of short fiction, poetry, and essays. Honest to God, choose a lane. Choose a lane. She's very widely published and is currently the Wallace Stegner Fellow in Fiction at Stanford University. That sounds really flash. Let's just say currently. And on the far end is Katerina Gibson, who has collected several major awards for her short fiction, including the Christina Stead Prize for fiction in this year's New South Wales Premier's Literary Awards for her short story collection, Women I Know. That's a big prize. And the chair of this session is the inimitable Michael Winkler, who has the distinction of being the first and only self-published author to be shortlisted for the Miles Franklin Award. That was for his acclaimed novel, Grimish, which I just think is a masterpiece. He is also a distinguished critic who publishes mostly in The Age, or the 9 newspapers. Thank you. Begin.
Thank you, Robert. Isn't it wonderful to have Robert here as the grand eminence of the festival? And thank you, everyone, for coming along. I have nothing to do with the programming of this festival, so when I was contacted and asked if I would be on this panel, and I was told who was on this panel, if you asked me to list the half dozen most exciting, most interesting writers in Australia, writers whose forthcoming books I will buy on site and devour, these 3 writers are all high on that very short list. So it says something about Joe Canham and this festival that they managed to get these 3 exceptional writers all together for the first time ever. Now, we're going to ask these people to read to us, and then we'll have a bit of a chat, and then, as is customary, later in the hour, we will ask for your questions. So think up some zingers for them. Kat, would you like to lead us off?
Microphone. I remember that. Okay.
I will say that her dedication is such that Kat was in Europe on about Wednesday, maybe, of this week, and she has flown straight here just for us.
We're becoming jet lagged together. Okay. I'm going to read from this story called The Shape Of. When she was 19, a man her father trusted approached her in the frozen food aisle of the grocer. He walked over while placing spinach in his basket. Instead of acknowledging her with a curt nod, he stopped and smiled. He told her he'd been feeling lonely since his wife left him. If it was all right with her, he would like to have her over for dinner. He would cook her authentic ratatouille, a dish she had learnt during his tenure in France. He would pay her, in cash, $400 to do so. That night, she told her father about the man's proposition. She did not mention the pay. He said that he was a nice man. She should go and listen to him complain. He was just lonely. The next evening, she put on a silver dress, silver shoes, a silver hair clip, and a large white coat with faux fur lining. On her arrival, she pressed the doorbell. The man opened the door, looked her up and down, and chuckled. "Come in," he said. He was wearing the pants and sweater of a retired businessman. He led her through the dining area on the second floor. They had sat on an enclosed balcony with floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the dense forest of the mountains. From there you could see down the valley to the tops of trees covered in snow, hear the eerie roar of wind tunneling through the trees, branches battling against the glass. The snow made her feel more ridiculous, as if she'd just intended to look like a winter nymph just wandered out of the forest. He sensed her self-consciousness and said she looked lovely, to not be embarrassed. He was sorry. He appreciated her taking his request so seriously. Within 5 minutes of starting dinner, he excused himself to the bathroom. When the man came back, his penis and a thumb of his shirt tail was hanging out of his zipper. She could tell from personal experience his penis was neither small nor large. It was exceptionally average penis. Circumcised, the colour of a faded bruise. Hanging just so to the left, a vein running down the centre and breaking off into small branches, like a river drying up. She did not say anything about the penis and soon understood she had done the right thing. Throughout dinner, he talked of his son and daughter. He was a personal trainer. She studied nursing. They both looked like their mother, although Claudia had got his nose, poor bugger. His ex-wife got only partial custody, but now the kids had left home early. They only ever called for money. He couldn't blame them, really.
Ben Walter, who was not in Europe but has swum all the way from Tasmania to be with us today. Ben.
Hi everybody, thanks Michael, and thanks also to Joe and everyone at Port Fairy for having us. It's a real privilege to be here. I'm just going to read about half of a short story, Beast Evolving, it's called. Can we keep him, I asked. Look at him run! He was bounding up the hills, fetching sticks to burn and lapping up pools of water in grass and trees, in the bodies of possums and roos. Here in the city, we'd never had a pet like this. Dogs who rained their skittering claws on the bones of old brick yard. Cats that ladled their bodies into the hollows of our arms. Fish that circled the dead dry pond like orange lights, telling us to wait and watch, to follow them slow before they blinked behind a rock. But we hurried past their brief lives, struggled with their names. Which cat had brown ears? Did he run away to feral hills on the eastern shore? Was he taken in the night or taken in the day? Was it just a long, slim needle that found its way precisely to a vein that made him just a little quieter than he'd been? Can we keep him? He'd be fine. We'd be cosy when the frost found fame in the depths of June. We brought him home and locked him in a box, dark like the metal had charred, and in the early mornings and fading afternoons we'd bolt him in that cell to heat our homes, and all his smoke would cough up the flue and smear the sky. Or we'd pull a couch near and watch his tricks, dancing in the corner and begging for kindling, and in the night he'd curl low around a couple of split logs, dense, hard cushions that yielded to his press and powdered to ash. Later, we'd sick him on the waste wood, prune from withering apples and plums that the new flies had fleeced. Push him under a plate to sear the rare meat in the back end of swollen summers, seasons overweight and straining, sun-fed, guts spilling into spring and autumn. Can we keep him? The bugger is he's always getting out. Leaping through the door and hurtling through the gate when the kids have left it swung, running over cars and snapping at feathers and fur, scraping back the peat with cold claws. and plucking so much pine in bright bouquets of flame. We watch in booing crowds as he's handed gum to gum, kicked long to the homes strung out drying in long lines of road, tackling their roofs and blistering the paint, sure of his heft, measuring his height against the baking years graphed out in anxious charts, a beast evolving proud and strong, chest straining as his muscles flare. He grins a foul grin as he licks up leaves.
Thank you, Ben. And Josephine.
I thought I would read the shortest couple of page thing in this collection, because I think very, very short stories are my first love, and maybe it would be nice to have something whole and self-contained. This is called What Passes for Fun. Somewhere close to the end of things, we drive past a pond and see that only its frozen surface remains, 2 inches thick and half an acre across, just levitating there. How is this possible, we ask ourselves, and we stop the car to look. The pond's surface has frozen around a stand of cattails, and that's what's propping it up now, all those thin, hollow stalks, as though it were the canopy of some modest structure, something we might assemble on a beach or in some other treeless place to keep the sun off the babies. Everything beneath the ice has drained away, everything that was not solid. Where the cattails stop, so does that unlikely architecture. Here is the edge of the frozen sheet, clean and deliberate as a cross-section, the fogged blue of sea glass. We can see where the cattails pass through the ice, spearing it, reaching on up into the January sky and holding the pond surface up there triumphantly, 3 feet above the ground. Beyond the cattails, the surface lies in hard white pieces in the empty bed, shattered like an opaque mirror. The babies want to crawl in under there and play, but we don't let them. A few broken stalks and the ice ceiling might collapse and crush them, but we understand the impulse. They have only recently learnt to walk, to fling themselves clumsily between what they have and what they want. You and I have been upright for decades, not having gained much grace for all that, and still we'd like to walk out onto it, onto the lofted ice, to see if this implausibility can hold our weight. But we are superstitious, because even though we can envisage the chain of events that might cause such a thing to happen, a blocked drain, a snap freeze, an unblocked drain, the surprising but not impossible strength of cattails, it is still magic. It is magic in the sense that there is no metaphor you can build out of it that will not undermine its magic. We stand at the roadside looking out at it for 10 or 15 minutes, holding tight to our daughters, who flap belligerently at the ends of our fingers like poorly trained kestrels. Then we get back into the car and drive to your sister's house, where the salmon is overdone and nothing extraordinary happens, where we try with our rickety metaphors and cannot even get them to judder across the tabletop. We watch them fall over between the salt shaker and the cruet stand. Your sister grows tired of humouring us and begins clearing the dinner plates with their neat little piles of translucent bones. What passes for fun with you two, she says. Christ Almighty. While your sister is in the kitchen, I swipe through the photographs and find every one of them wanting, paling in comparison to the remembered pond. I hold the phone up for you to look. This isn't quite it, is it? No, you say, leaning across the table. That just looks like an ordinary frozen pond. Several hours and many miles before the uplifted pond, I had prayed, in a vague and wordless sort of way, to whatever nameless thing we entreat when we do not believe in God. It's hypocritical, you've told me this, to still want signs, to scratch for evidence of predestination, something bigger than ourselves with its chin above our heads, its paws upon our shoulders, something to tell us, yes, go on, this is the way to go. But at your sister's table, we are still working with what we have. What we have is whatever hasn't drained away. I say this aloud. I am that dumb. I wind it up and I let it go. Watch it teeter, then topple over. Salt shaker, cruet stand, before it gets to you. Sitting right there across from me, still hopeful. Still waiting for something you can trust your weight on.
And there's 3 good examples of the magic that these magicians can wreak with language. The novel never... I'm aware that all 3 of you, I think, have written novels, although only Josephine's has been published as yet. The novel never seems to have to defend itself, but the short story form is always being defended or argued for. Tell us about the short story form. What do you love about it? Why should it be allowed to exist? Jump in.
I don't know, I think it's quite funny that you always have to be like on the defense for the for the short story form. But what I like about it is it's like an execution of exactly one idea really well, which I don't think you can do in a novel, really. And you can have a little bit more fun in a short story. That's my soundbite.
And I'm very, very slow. But I think more, I think there's a kind of pact with a reader and a short story writer that wherever you're going, it's just going to be for a certain number of pages. So I feel like it is more open to experimentation and for trying out different things, for also to the sort of density and distillation you get in poetry, which sustaining that over a novel as both a writer and a reader can be like a little bit cloying maybe. But with a short story for that shorter whole, I don't know. I read somewhere very, very simply that everything in a short story needs to point to everything outside the short story, which I think is a tidy way of doing it. So the sort of afterglow you get from a short story is often bigger than the sum of its parts.
Mm.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with both of those things. I just feel like, as a writer, how much fun is it to spend a few weeks working on a completely new and distinct thing that tries to occupy a peculiar vision, and then you finish it, and then you get to do it all over again. And for a reader, it's the same possibility that a reader can encounter something really distinct and unusual over what might be 1 page or it might be 20 pages. And I mean, some of the best short story collections, and I found this, rereading the collections by Josephine and Kat, the visions are so good that you almost need to put it down after one story. You read them and you've been so affected in a singular way that you say, okay, I just need to let this sit with me for a little while. And then I'll come back to the book again in an hour, and the same thing happens over and over again. And I think just for engaging with aesthetics and creativity as a writer and a reader, that's an enormous privilege. It's something that you can have these really conspicuous effects in this brief period of time and then do it all over again.
Mm.
Oh, I just love what you said about, the sort of putting it down and the space between, because I feel the same way. Definitely reading both of your works, it kind of made me think about how you need to put your knife and fork down to be able to sort of taste and appreciate a meal properly. And it's much the same. I found myself doing that a lot with both of your books.
Kat, you used the word fun. Now, I have many issues with contemporary literature, but one of them is a conspicuous lack of fun in particularly the contemporary novel. There's a lot of fun in your book.
Thank you.
One sentence that I did enjoy. I ask nicely because of all our appliances, the fridge is particularly sensitive. I forgot to say good morning once and she froze my cauliflower. It's not a book of gags, but it's a book where the writer is clearly at different points having fun. Why have fun?
Why have fun? I mean, it's definitely an amusing. I had a sidebar. I had a teacher once in undergrad who told me I didn't mean to do like gags, but she's like the punchlines are slowing it down a little bit, and I didn't realize I was like hammy in punchlines. But there was like one story in there that's just like line after line of like different story ideas, which was like
would you like to read what the title of that is?
Sure.
Because the title's fantastic.
I've actually forgotten the name of it, which is quite funny. It's called Intermission 1, All the Stories I Started But Never Finished Because of the Time Restrictive and Distracting Nature of the Gig Economy. Yeah. But I guess it's not that I think you should only have fun. I think, you should be aiming for moments of clarity. And I suppose like with all writing or reading, or when I find that I've read something that's amazing, it's because it's articulated something that I didn't realize was universal. But fun's half of it for me, I think. And the short story, like you were saying, Josephine, when you can try something out that you wouldn't be able to sustain over a novel length, like a particular voice, can be really fun to pick up. A quite, neurotic woman's in a monologue for a while and just have a lot of fun with that. And I think if you have fun while writing it, people are going to enjoy it more. I've had a few writers, and I understand, say how much they hate writing. And I'm like, you don't have to do it. No one is making you. Yeah. But I don't know.
Ben, your collection, one of the many things that fascinates me about it is that roughly half the stories are these incredibly well-realised visions of being in the Tasmanian landscape, and they tend to be really... intense is not quite the right word, but they're beautifully wrought stories, quite sort of hermetic in some ways, and yet... roughly half your stories, they're not wacky, that's too strong, but there is one where someone rings up an art gallery and Tony Gregg answers the phone, and another one where Leslie Nielsen is driving around. Why work in both registers? Why not just stick to one thing?
I think what I find, if we go back to the notion of fun, the flip side of that is that a significant reason as to why I write is to avoid being bored. And I think, trying to write interesting things is a great alleviation for personal boredom. And it just happens that if a reader also finds that my stories alleviate their boredom, that's a bonus. But the fact of avoiding being bored means if you're just doing the same thing all the time, then I find that boring. And to the extent that if I write a story which is in a similar register 4 or 5 times maybe, I feel like I'm starting to get in a rut, and I just like to change it up enormously. And that can be challenging because you end up trying to reinvent wheels over and over again in some ways to write completely different types of short stories. But I think that's all the pursuit of challenging yourself and then trying to do something new, at least relatively often, because it's so easy to get lazy. I'm at my happiest, I think, and most uncomfortable as a writer when I don't quite understand how to do what it is I want to do. And that's really frustrating for a while, but then you end up making for completely different solutions to problems than you otherwise would have. And I think that that's what keeps you fresh and what keeps you writing relatively original work.
Mm-hmm. There's like this, I've been reading this Jhumpa Lahiri book, the one she wrote half in Italian. And I think it's like a paraphrase, but she talks about how comfortability is like the opposite of creativity, or like the antithesis to it. So you just have to be like continually uncomfortable. It's so cool. Yeah,
I think that's right. And to a degree, that's hard, because if you're writing, because you've got to write to enjoy what you're doing, because there's not much point otherwise. You've got to be enjoying your writing, because the rewards otherwise are fairly limited. So you have to be prepared to push through that discomfort, I think, of of not knowing where you are and trying to throw yourself into deep end after deep end in order to find the satisfactions that come out at the end of that as you finally get this sort of wholeness or realisation of whatever it was you were setting out to try to do.
I like that you hitched the word happiness to uncomfortable as well. Like, I am at my happiest and most uncomfortable. Yeah, that about sums it up, I think, that state.
Jo, you mentioned that you have a tendency to, your short stories almost shrink and get smaller and smaller.
Oh, yeah.
I'm not a huge, I know that the whole flash fiction, nano fiction thing has taken off, and I guess it has its place, but how small is too small? At what point do you actually lose some of that snow globe magic that is in a really good short story?
Right. You just pack a denser snow globe. I think of writers like Kawabata, who started in very short fiction and then kind of went to novel and then compressed some of those novels towards the end of his life back into the shorter form. So I don't know how I feel about the word flash fiction or minimalism, because I don't necessarily, that doesn't go with how I imagine things. Or I just want to be able to evoke whatever kind of atmosphere or tone or conundrum in the smallest possible, most potent space. And often that means kind of like lots of, a sentence needs to be doing 2 or 3 things at the once, and how you can kind of get things between the lines. I would hope that everything that I take out of it does kind of imprint, leave a shadow, leave something that's maybe not directly articulated, but it's more of a felt sense. And I think that can sometimes be stronger than filling in all the blanks and all the detail, is to leave enough room. I mean, because the mind, if you give silence, if you give blackness, like there's nothing you can kind of say that is going to be as, our minds do so much with silence. So if you allow a reader to kind of make the connections for themselves, one, it's not going to be a static story then. Everybody's going to interpret it differently and at different, different variations depending on when they come to it. And that's kind of more interesting to me, that it almost has a richer life then. Yeah.
The next session today, which has got amazing Shannon Burns, Jessie Cole and Eve Rees, is called, is it The Art of Omission? The Art of Omission. And I think of that particularly perhaps with your work. Can you share with us your process?
Oh my God.
How do you know what to leave out? At what point do you think, oh, okay, that's got to go, and at what point do you get it wrong?
Oh my God, I'm sort of embarrassed for anybody to see any of my early drafts, because I just look absolutely insane. There'll be these sort of gaping holes, and then there'll be one sentence written 17 different ways. I'm not even joking. It's kind of this like re-editing, and parts of it will be kind of crystallized, and other parts will still be kind of, mist and fog and a few stepping stones. So I don't know that anybody should listen to me about process.
I think we should all listen to you about process. No, don't. Before you. Could you actually describe, because I think we've got a lot of writers as well as readers here. Could you describe, what does it actually look like, your work page?
I should have brought in one of my notebooks, because the sort of writing is very small, and it's like Walser, but it goes around the corners and things like that. So it might be a kind of like particular scene that I'll Oh, I don't know, Michael. I'm very bad at this part.
All right,
but
don't worry.
when Ben said before that, how satisfying is it to just write a story in a few weeks? I'm like, you can write a story in a few weeks? That's amazing. No wonder you're having fun.
I didn't say they were any good.
There's a lot of paper. I write mostly longhand, and will kind of just bring in the screen when I need to. But I think that is also a reason that novels become more difficult if you're moving around a lot and you're a sort of very visual writer, because for A Loving Faithful Animal, I think that was kind of like the most geographic and residential stability I'd had in 10 years.
Josephine's novel, yeah.
Yeah, and I think there's something about the short story that fits with a kind of transient existence. You think of Raymond Carver as well, and the sort of like those, jumping from job to job and that sort of thing. So if you have a sort of unstructured life, that's where maybe short story fits better than a novel. Although the novel itself as a point of a means of continuity is kind of a reassuring thing as well.
Ben, Josephine's had to show and tell, so I don't see why you should get off. What's your process? How do you know what to put in and what to leave out?
I do a lot of printing out and scribbling because I edit off paper. I find editing off screen is really problematic. I need it with paper. And editing and changing and these kinds of things. I mean, in a funny sort of way, I think it's very instinctual. I think that you're reliant very much on the sound of something and how it feels when you're editing. And in some ways, that's the writing too. I mean, I feel like when I'm writing okay, it's because the writing is like it's not being ground out. It's starting to enter into a kind of flow state where I'm being carried along by the rhythms of the work itself, which doesn't mean that at the end of it it's necessarily good, but it is. It feels right in the moment. But then it goes back and honestly, I've got 3 kids who just destroy paper, and I go through more paper than they do, just in terms of printing things out and annotating and changing back again. And I think what I'm trying to do is enter into a feeling of wholeness with the text, where there are no jolts to the rhythm, there are no jolts to the concepts that I'm trying to use as I work through reading the text. And I'll just do this multiple times, and then a few weeks later I'll start the whole thing again with my brain fresh and a little bit more distance from the text. So I think that's what it is. It's almost like you're trying to smooth and sculpt everything away that feels even just a little bit wrong in the text. Because there's obvious wrongs, there's obvious things that you cut or you change. And then there's things that you go, oh, maybe that's fine, oh, maybe that's fine, oh, maybe that's not fine. And you realise you have to change that up too. Or it's just a lazy word, like a lazy verb that's not quite precise enough that you've been getting away with for about 20 drafts. And then you look at it and you go, that needs to change, that verb needs to be made more specific. So it's just an endless polishing, I think.
None of this surprises me, because the reason I told you that these writers are the writers that I care most about is because when I read them, I can tell that they have worked on their prose and they've thought about things like a lazy verb on draft 20. Kat, a story of yours that I know a lot of people have picked out of your collection as a favourite, even if it's not a favourite of yours, is Constellation in the Left Eye. And reviewers have noted that a lot of the power of this story comes from the omission of certain details.
Yeah, that one I confessed to Michael just before this started that I almost cut it from the collection, but my publisher didn't let me. And I'm very glad, because but definitely, although I think that one, the omission comes from, I don't know if it's the voice is almost verbose, but it's the omission of the details surrounding her own circumstance, potentially. I haven't actually read it.
Could you sketch for us what that story is about?
I guess it's about like a climate refugee who may or may not be from France, who is stuck in some sort of factory / live-in situation in Australia, where she has to make sex dolls, which kind of is revealed slowly over the course of the story. And she's kind of realizing that she's made her own sex doll at some point. Yeah, that's about it. Yeah.
Mm. But we're never exactly sure what's going on.
Yeah.
And that slipperiness is so effective. Yeah. 1 minute before we walked in here, I mentioned short stories and whether a short story has to have a story. And Josephine wondered whether it does need a story. Does it need a story, Josephine?
What defines story? What do we mean by story?
I don't know.
Yeah, I don't know. I like beginning, middle, end, satisfying. Like ends are arbitrary. We know their stories don't actually end. So, I mean, I think a lot of the best short story writers have worked out like the cadence of a sound of an ending that sounds satisfying. If you read a lot of like Dennis Johnson's short stories, you're kind of like, you'll get in Jesus' Son, you'll find yourself with the kind of bodily, physical satisfaction of an ending, and then you look twice. Wait, that wasn't an ending. Nothing was tied up there. I think I kind of gravitate to works that don't conform to a particular structure or to kind of handing over anything in a sort of easy, predefined, Freytagian sort of way. So.
I think that the best short stories leave readers with a strong sense of feeling, and conventional plot satisfaction is a very narrow possibility for that sense of feeling. Like the idea that something ties itself together. That's a really narrow feeling. But there are all sorts of other feelings that a story can leave a person with that may be unconventional or surprising. And that's enough, I think, that it doesn't need to have that beginning, middle, end structure. It just needs to leave people feeling something powerful. And I feel like that's maybe analogous to that idea of an ending that's not actually an ending. Yeah.
I like the whole George Saunders, that almost epiphany of a short story ending, not a full. You don't want someone to have like a full epiphany. It's maybe a little bit too much, but like a beginning of a feeling or something to kind of leave the reader to feel in the rest is my favourite non-ending.
Rereading these collections, there was a phrase from the Polish writer Czesław Miłosz that came to my mind, which was that writers were secretaries of the invisible. And I think, with all of you actually, there's a lot of sort of fairly quotidian settings and things that may be even regarded as banal in terms of things that take place. But you are guiding us and letting us know what's really going on, or hinting at what's really going on. And that's this sort of emotional meteorology, How does that work as a short story writer? How do you create that magic thing?
I'm like tempted to write down emotional meteorology. I don't like that very much.
There's a phrase, I think, in one of Ben's stories where in a relationship where the cold front of one partner meets the warm front of another, and the weather system that is created. Is that true, Ben, or have I made that up?
I can't remember.
Sorry, Joe, please go on.
That's okay. I don't know where I was going. I was just saying that I like that phrase. I think the sense of discovery in writing is what is part of the engine of it for me. Stories that kind of occupy that quotidian space, like you say, but also seem to either reach back into or move forward into dream. And again, these are Katerina and Ben's books. I've found that a lot. Often I will kind of read short stories when I first wake up in the morning when I'm still in that gauzy space. And I found that Ben's and Katerina's stories would sort of like still leave me with one foot in dream. I'm kind of interested where you guys.
I think that the wonderful thing, one of the wonderful things about writing is you can do anything. You can do absolutely anything that you might want to pursue, anything that you might find interesting. There's this whole non-realist space that opens up, which means that you can enter into the dreamlike if you want to, or you can enter into something that just seems like an interesting idea to pursue. And sometimes that's at its most interesting when it is a skewing of a kind of reality that we recognise and find ourselves familiar with, because that is like the dream, isn't it? It's a skewing of reality. And it doesn't necessarily have to be in predictable ways too. It doesn't have to be like a conventional magical realist style of work. It just means that there are elements of I guess, the conventionally uncanny, the familiar but not familiar in terms of how a work can articulate itself. But I think, again, that comes back to the very first question that you were asking, Michael, is the amazing possibilities of the short story form to do something like that you can get away with blending the reality with the non-reality in a million different ways. I mean, one of the best ways, I think, of trying to make a short story work is finding some sort of synthesis between two or three completely disparate ideas. And I feel like the possibilities of language and ideas are so endless and so infinite that there's always going to be at least one interesting way of doing that. And in that making of wholeness is one of its pleasures.
Yeah, I definitely feel that way, and it's like both with Ben and Josephine, even with how Ben, I find you've just integrated this kind of Tasmanian magical realism, so it's just so part of your style that it seems, even though some of it's like whack, it's like, why is there a talking wombat? It just seems it seems completely normal when you're in the story because it's your style. And with both of you, I feel like I could pick up like one of your stories anywhere and recognize the tone, which is like a really like incredible thing when you've made that like, I think you're making your own, not style, but space or dreamlike, I don't know, thing. Don't really know where I'm going with that, but
it's also true of you though, Kat, that with all three of you, and it's a rare thing. You know who's writing it, as varied as the stories are.
I was like, there's a lot going on, but yeah.
It's a good thing.
It is. But with me, I think for some of it, it's a lot of a short story is me trying to figure something out as well. It's a way of, I think sometimes we think of writers as being very articulate. Oh, and I'm sure a lot of us are, except me. But a lot of it's me trying to figure out a feeling for myself, so kind of like walking into that and seeing where it goes.
And part of that is your commitment to experimentation and to actually making something new.
Yeah. Well, like you were talking, Ben, about like how you're joining like a couple of different ideas to like do a short story, and for me a lot of these ones were like, oh, I'd really like to write a story in the shape of a river, but you've got no reason to do that, so you put that away for half a year, and then a completely different
This is the story in the shape of a river.
A completely different idea comes along, and they kind of like merge together, and you're like, oh, that's what that was for, and it's really lovely when they kind of crash into each other like that.
Yeah, sometimes you just need to be patient, don't you? I can relate to that enormously, where you have a bit of an idea, but you know there's not enough in the thing itself. You say, okay, we'll just have to wait until something else turns up to make it work.
Yeah.
So if you're writing stories in the shape of a river, and your final story in here, Kat, is pretty much sort of a 7-page sentence. Well, it moves into that near the end. Ben, one of your stories is, I think, 3 sentences that stretch across 3 pages with no capital letter at the start and no full stop at the end. Are you just actually poets who refuse to come out of the closet?
Yes.
Yes.
No, because I'm a mediocre poet. Every now and then I can latch onto a poem, but I don't consider myself much of a poet. So maybe it's just that there's something about this form that is its own thing, you know, and maybe it has a certain particular sensibility that's hard to pigeonhole. I don't know. Yeah.
I don't know. I know Josephine's an actual published poet. Like, you write poems, or have written poems, yes. But I just read a lot of poetry, so maybe that's it. Yeah.
The space between is my favourite space. That's it. I mean, poetry is very concerned with form as well. So if you sort of put yourself into some kind of marshy middle ground, then, yeah, I don't know.
I mean, anyone who can write a sentence such as "crimpline's just another word for lazy," she said. I think that's a poem there in itself. Yeah. You haven't worn crimpline for us here today?
Oh, I would never.
Ben used the word rhythm, and I think so much of excellence. I mean, I'm not a poetry person. I'm seeking wonderful poetic prose, and it's when people have cared about the rhythm. How do you get the rhythm right? I mean, with you, Ben, I've written this, that I have read your stuff aloud while walking to try to work out if your rhythms match my steps. And I wonder if there is some linkage between you being a very eager pedestrian and your very non-pedestrian prose.
I feel that I don't understand it, but in some peculiar way, when I was working out how to be a prose writer, or, I mean, that assumes that I finished, but in that process of discovering whatever voice or practice that you end up using for the majority of time, for some reason I ended up with this set of internal rhythms that I have to align to in the text. And I have no idea why, and I have no idea how that happened. I've no idea whether I read, you know, voluminous amounts of text which influenced what I considered to be the right approach to rhythm. I just don't know. But what I do know is that an enormous part of the pleasure of writing and then the pleasure of editing is conforming the text to those rhythms which just feel right. And so it's bizarre. I've got absolutely no idea. But it just seems to be the process that I've ended up on for ending up with a text that I feel moderately happy with. Yeah.
When I'm reading your stories, Ben, I think of the word forest legs, which was what an activist friend said about, you know, like living out in Florentine for a while, and leaving the forest for a while, coming back and initially being clumsy, but then finding their forest legs again. I feel like your stories have very good forest legs.
Yeah, but you use rhythm too. Like, I mean, I think of like the rhythm of your sentences, especially like, you know, the way that you'll use like a longer sentence and then shorter sentences and these kinds of things to create such a really strong sense of feeling as well. Like, you must be, whether that's a form of forest legs as well, I'm not sure. But are you paying attention to that as you go?
I'm paying attention. I think it's an ear thing. It's an instinct thing. There's not a kind of calculated, this is going to, they'll love this. It's just, it's part of that kind of flow that is organic to that particular story or that particular voice as well of whatever character. I think there are a couple of characters in August who speak English as a second language, and I think it's always interesting to me to listen to my friends who have come to English later in their life to hear the way it breaks, and you understand English better, I think, or the construction of language better, to hear the way things transpose or don't quite transpose. So maybe a lot of it is just listening to people, the world.
That sounds a perfect time to say that it's time to listen to questions from Anyone who would like to ask these people a question? Oh, there must be. I've got more questions, but you don't want to hear more of my questions. There must be some very clever questions up there. Yeah.
You ever write a short story and feel a sense of loss because it could have become a much longer story and much extended?
So that question was, do you ever write a short story and feel a sense of loss because it could have become a bigger story, you could have extended it?
No, not for me. But that's just because I think with a short story there's a different structure. Even if they're structureless, there's a different structure to it. In that extending it would ruin it a little bit, I think. And you know it's a short story when you kind of finish it and go, that's kind of it. Even if other people later on say, I wanted to know what happens next. It's like, no, that's for you. That's for you to decide. But not for me. Yeah.
Yeah, I feel like a story has a kind of trajectory, and that as you're writing it, it occupies that trajectory, and you know kind of when it's done. It feels right to end it. And sometimes you get it wrong. Like sometimes you might have a brief for a short story that has to be this length, and you just can't meld the story that you're writing into that length. It just needs to be the length that story happens to need to be. So I think that's kind of, it would feel worse, I think, to try and make it into something that it wasn't. And that would be where the loss would feel, I think. Yeah.
It's a really interesting question. I've definitely tried things out in one form, have had them not work, put them aside and come back to visit them in a different form maybe years later, whether that's, starting in story and ending up in poetry, or starting in poetry and ending up in novel or whatever. There's a novel that I've been working on for 20 years, just in the background there. It might be like the most consistent aspect of my life is this novel that kind of runs like a subterranean river beneath everything else, and then just sort of pops up now and again. And that's gone through so many variations of style and form. I suppose the other thing is, like, what's to stop you returning to an idea that you want to further, or that I definitely feel like I've ruined good ideas in stories before for maybe having to rush or make a deadline or something. It's like forcing an orgasm. It's kind of like, well, why did we do that? Rather than having, a more layered experience. So, yeah, deadlines are helpful in some respects, but sometimes it just kind of, compresses something into it doesn't allow for things to unfold or realize in a way that you would ideally have.
You might have to rush it out after just 16 drafts rather than the full 17.
Exactly.
More questions? Yes.
Are there particular writers, short fiction writers, who inspired you in the early days or now?
Josephine? That is a very big list for me, and I like for everyone. Foster Wallace was a very big and early and now like kind of influence that I kind of can't get rid of. You can kind of see him in my very long sentences. His short story collection, Brief Interviews with Hideous Man, is one of my favourite. But then there's also Maxine Beneba Clark and Julie Coe, who did a lot of experimental stuff that I really latched on to early. And I'll leave it at that, otherwise I'll just keep talking. So.
I don't know. I find the idea of influence really, really hard to understand. Because I feel like I've read so many books that I've loved, and working out what it is that has been significant influences on me, it almost feels like I would just be arbitrarily pulling names out of my hat. So I feel like that's a completely useless answer, but it would be like picking favourites from a huge range of different writers that I can't tease out who helped me with what. So, yeah, I find that a hard question to answer. Yeah.
I'm trying to think of writers that kind of, lit me up at 17 or 18 and still light me up now. Jane Ann Phillips is one, an American writer who should be so much more well-known and well-appreciated than she is. I don't quite understand why not. But her short story collection, Black Tickets, was something I read when I was in my late teens. Again, it just has that sort of that density to it, that fullness, that richness. When I read her novels, that becomes more of a slog, I think. There isn't the same amount of breathing space and magic around the potency of her short stories. Lucia Berlin, nowadays, that's more recent. Michael Ondaatje is coming through Slaughter, which starts with Dolphin Sonar. I think was a good reminder that you can do anything in fiction.
I had the same with Cadwyn Dovey's Only the Animals.
Say that again.
Only the Animal by Cadwyn
right.
Dovey. That was one of the ones the same.
All right, put all them on your list. I reckon we've got time for one more question.
I'm fascinated by the concept of the ending being feeling or almost epiphany. So I'm wondering where does the inspiration for that come in the writing of the story?
I feel that it comes by necessity from what has happened before it. So if you've done enough of the work to make something new in the lead up, then there's a way to resolve, or I mean, resolve is the wrong word, but to culminate that in a satisfying feeling for you as a writer, and hopefully for the reader as well. In some ways, that makes in saying that, it makes it feel a little banal, kind of saying that it comes from what's before it. But I think that's right. I think it just has to. It has to refine the feeling that you've been working up to and giving rise to in the text that far. And I think that you're lucky if you cotton on to the right one. Like, I've got stories where I've sort of done it and I go, yeah, it's okay, it's not bad, it's not exactly right, but I may have cheaped out. But then there are other stories where I go, yep, I feel like that was exactly what I was searching for in bringing all that's come before it to a head.
Yeah, I was thinking what Katerina was saying before about a story usually often starting out as trying to figure out something, or you arrive with a question, and ideally the epiphany is kind of genuine for the author. Those are the best, where you really do feel like you have uncovered something, or the best essays, stories, poems for me, as far as my experience of writing them goes, is when there is something that surprises you or reveals itself to you, and I feel like that's what keeps you coming back. That's the dopamine blush. It's like the moments. There it was.
And you can feel the writer doing the same thing when you're reading it. You can see that they've only realised. That's my favourite story. Is when they've kind of there's been a movement or something, and you can feel that they've just, like, a couple of paragraphs right before the end have realised what it's going towards.
Well, I get a dopamine. Was it a dopamine blush? I get a dopamine blush from reading these three writers and from having the opportunity to hear from them today. I would encourage you to purchase their books and to insist that they sign them for you. Josephine will probably have to do 17 drafts of the signature. All of their books are just wonderful. If you live in this area, or indeed if you are a visitor, I urge you very strongly to support Blarney Books, because this is the bookshop that supports writers. So if you want to buy a book and you want to support the shop that supports writers, please buy from Blarney Books. I would also like to very quickly mention Joe Canham. I know that there is a committee that puts together this weekend, but Joe Canham is a rare and very special person in the Australian literary ecosystem. I know she grew up in a town that was flooded and moved, which is possibly why she chose two writers who have got stories about towns that were flooded and moved. So if you bump into Jo over the weekend, please tell her she's a superstar. Would you please thank Josephine, Ben and Kat?